Today's case is simply tragic in every aspect and has destroyed more than one life. It revolves around a boy named Joel Kirkpatrick. His parents were Julie Rhea and Len Kirkpatrick. They married quite young. Len was 18 and Julie was only 17. Due to Julie's young age, her parents had to consent to the marriage. Her parents were both missionaries, and Julie originally came from Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States. Julie was busy pursuing her doctorate in educational psychology, while Len aspired to a career in law enforcement. Len eventually became a state trooper, while Julie's education was put on hold. In July 1987, their only son, Joel, was born. But, as often happens in life, things don't always go as planned. For Julie and Len, despite being young and in love, and blessed with a son, things began to get complicated. Their marriage started to show cracks. They attended couples counseling for a year to save their marriage. However, ultimately, Julie left the family home with Joel when he was just 6 years old. When Joel was 7, in 1994, the divorce became official. Initially, Julie and Len shared custody, but when Len remarried, everything changed. In August 1997, he was granted full custody of Joel by the court, and Julie only had her son on weekends. In 1997, where our case begins, Joel was a 10-year-old and quite a smart little fellow. His intelligence amazed everyone around him. His father, Len, often said Joel was the smartest kid he had ever met. His teachers, too, couldn't stop praising him for his academic achievements. Joel's mother, Julie, describes her son as kind, empathetic, and really funny. A boy with a big heart. Joel often mentioned that he dreamed of becoming a video game developer, probably a lucrative career that would have truly showcased his creativity and intelligence. But sadly, that was not to be. It's the weekend of October 13th, 1997, and Julie had Joel with her for the weekend. It was a long weekend because there was no school on the coming Monday due to a holiday. Joel asked his mother if he could stay an extra night with her. Julie asked Len, Joel's father, and he agreed. Of course, without knowing that this decision would have tragic consequences. On Sunday evening, October 12th, mother and son went out for milkshakes, and later in the evening, they met Joel's friend, Evan Woodward, and his mother, Trenna, at home. The children watched the movie Aladdin, while the mothers sat together at the kitchen table, busy with scrapbooking. But the evening took an unexpected turn. Joel wasn't feeling well and wanted to go to bed early. Julie, of course, put him to bed, and as she did every night, prayed with him and told him she loved him before leaving the room. She remembers locking the front door, but couldn't recall if she had locked the back door. It was around 4 o'clock in the morning, a time when most people are fast asleep. But not on this night, and not in Julie's house. She was suddenly awakened by a terrible scream. A scream so horrific that Julie initially couldn't believe it was her son Joel. But then, the terrible realization hit. Worried about her son, she gets up to investigate, calling Joel's name. No answer. Imagine the panic that must have gripped her at that moment. Julie jumped out of bed and ran to Joel's room, but his bed was empty. What happened next sounds like something out of a nightmare. A man rose from the opposite side of Joel's bed and lunged at Julie. In a desperate fight for her life and that of her son, Julie used everything she had to defend herself. She had a black belt in Taekwondo, so she knew how to defend against a physical attack. The fight moved into the hallway and continued there until the man tried to escape through the back door. And Julie, driven by maternal instinct, held onto his pant leg. In the struggle, she and the stranger broke through the glass of the back door, and she was dragged into the garden by the man, to whom she was still desperately clinging so he wouldn't escape. I didn't know where Joel was, and I didn't know what to do. I screamed for help, she says. I fell to the ground. And then the man took Julie's head and repeatedly slammed it on the ground to finally break free from her. When he had finally fought her off, he stood up, took off his mask, and disappeared into the darkness. She was visibly marked from the fight with the intruder. She had a black eye, a cut on her arm, and scraped knees. Confused and frightened, Julie believed her son had just been kidnapped. In a state of utmost desperation, she ran to a neighbor's house to ask for help. The police arrived around 4:30 in the morning, and the officers began to search Julie's house. What they found in Joel's bedroom was truly heartbreaking. Joel's lifeless body, wedged between his bed and the wall, exactly where the unknown man had risen and attacked her when Julie surprised him in Joel's room. A terrible discovery that changed everything. What the police discovered in Joel's room was an absolute shock. They found Joel dead, his t-shirt bloody from multiple stab wounds to the chest. When Julie learned that her son was dead, she broke into screams. She was completely stunned. She couldn't and didn't want to believe what had happened. She insisted that Joel couldn't possibly be dead, that it all must be a terrible mistake. But reality was relentless and cruel. The truth that Julie finally had to accept was devastating. Her only son, her little boy, was dead. Joel had been stabbed 12 times. 2 of these stabs had directly hit his aorta, the largest artery in the human body, which carries blood from the heart to the rest of the body. There was no chance that Joel could have survived these brutal injuries. Julie herself was taken to the hospital with a black eye, carpet burns on her knees, a wound on her right arm that needed stitches, as well as scratches and abrasions on her head, both shoulders, and the tips of her feet. The condition of Julie's house raised some questions for the police. To the officers, it didn't look like a fight had taken place there, as one would expect in a break-in. Julie claimed that the fight with the intruder had extended through the entire hallway to the back door, but the investigators doubted this. They didn't find enough evidence to confirm Julie's story about a fight. Even more puzzling was where the murder weapon was found, a knife lying in the middle of the hallway. The police determined that the knife didn't appear to have been thrown away, as it would have been in a fight. It was clean and without blood splatters, which raised the question of how it got there. Even stranger was that the knife came from Julie's own kitchen. Why would an intruder come into the house without a weapon, and then use a knife from the kitchen? The story became even more peculiar when Julie's ex-husband, Len, mentioned that the butcher block from which the knife came was a gift to her, given at the last Christmas they had spent together as a couple. A fact that could be interpreted in many different ways. But what really made the police suspicious were the blood stains on Julie's shirt, especially near her shoulders. It turned out to be Joel's blood. How did the blood get there if Julie thought her son had been kidnapped? All these elements made Julie a prime suspect in the eyes of the police. In child murders, parents often become suspects. Both Julie and her ex-husband were questioned by the police. The officers learned that their divorce had been bitter, and they had fought for custody of Joel, a proceeding that her ex-husband, Len Kirkpatrick, had recently won because Julie moved around a lot. Len Kirkpatrick believes it was his ex-wife Julie who killed their son. He said, "I think it was simply about, if I can't have Joel, you can't either." After the murder, Julie couldn't bear to be alone. She was afraid of the dark and barely slept. She lived in an apartment an hour and a half away, and had to commute from there to her doctoral studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. She had friends staying with her around the clock in shifts. To fall asleep, I had to have someone on both sides and the light on, she said. While she managed to keep her position at the university, she was plagued by panic attacks and debilitating anxieties. Investigators showed up unannounced at her home and workplace several times. Despite the initial suspicions, the investigators treated Julie as if she were telling the truth. This was an important step because sometimes the key to the truth lies in the most unexpected statements. When the local police realized they were overwhelmed by the complexity of the case, the Illinois State Police was called in. They asked Julie for a description of the attacker, as she had seen him without a mask during his escape. Julie helped create a composite sketch of the unknown man. After the composite sketch was published, an employee at the local Greyhound bus station contacted the investigators. She claimed to have sold a ticket to a man matching the description. Although this lead initially led nowhere, it would later prove important. Other people in the town also reported sightings of the mysterious man. One person reported seeing a man resembling the composite sketch at the train station. A group of teenagers even told the police that they were at a party where kids came in covered in blood, boasting about having killed someone. However, all these leads led to no concrete trail. The police increasingly focused on Julie. She was, of course, frustrated and believed that the police were wasting their time investigating her. Nevertheless, she cooperated and even took 2 lie detector tests, both of which came back positive for her. Both tests were conducted by a private company, not the police. The investigation against Len Kirkpatrick, Joel's father, also led nowhere. He also passed 2 lie detector tests, and his new wife provided him with an alibi, confirming that he had been with her all night. There was never any evidence suggesting that Len was involved in the murder. A year after Joel's tragic death, Julie's family offered a reward. They hoped someone would come forward with information that could lead to the arrest of the murderer. However, despite these efforts, the reward went unclaimed and no new leads emerged. At the same time, a new prosecutor named Ed Parkinson took on the case. When he looked at all the facts again, he was convinced of Julie's guilt and presented the case to a grand jury. On the eve of the 3rd anniversary of Joel's murder, in October 2000, this jury brought 2 counts of first-degree murder against Julie. A warrant was then issued for her arrest. On October 13, 2000, the Sun commercial newspaper published an article titled "Mother Arrested for Murder," with the subtitle "Jury Indicts Julie Kirkpatrick for Son's Death." This article states, Lawrenceville, Illy, the Indiana State Police arrested Julie on Thursday based on a Lawrence County Circuit Court warrant on suspicion of first-degree murder in connection with the death of her son Joel. Kirkpatrick, 31, from Bloomington, Indiana, was served the warrant at 8:30 p.m. on Thursday evening in the crisis unit of Bloomington Hospital, according to Sergeant Mark Clefane of the Indiana State Police. Clefane explained that a Monroe County judge had ordered Kirkpatrick to be held there as it was a secure unit. Clefane said that the crisis unit is a psychiatric ward that also treats patients with other problems such as chemical dependency and stress. After a 6-hour hearing on Thursday, the Lawrence County grand jury brought a dual indictment against Kirkpatrick for first-degree murder. The first charge alleges she intentionally stabbed her son. Another charge alleges she stabbed him with intent to kill. As grand jury proceedings are legally confidential, further details about the charges are not known. Before Kirkpatrick can be extradited from Indiana to Illinois, extradition must be granted. Bail will be set after her first appearance before the Lawrence County Circuit Court. Imagine Julie's situation. She turned herself into the police without resistance and continued to maintain her innocence. Julie was indicted, despite the lack of a clear motive or conclusive evidence for the act. Prosecutor Ed Parkinson believed that although the first prosecutor had refused to press charges due to a lack of substantial evidence, he had strong arguments for Julie's guilt. And although it was purely circumstantial, he was firmly convinced that this would be enough to convict Julie. Due to the high media interest, the trial was moved to another county, Wayne County, Illinois. There, Julie was assigned the public defender, Brad Vaughn. During the trial, the prosecution presented a series of arguments against Julie. They pointed out that Julie's house showed no signs of a struggle and that there was no evidence of forceful entry, although Julie couldn't remember if she had locked the back door. A notable statement from the officers related to the dew on the grass in front of Julie's house. They claimed it was undisturbed, which called her story of an intruder into question. It was also argued that the broken glass door was staged, as the glass was found outside rather than inside. Another central point of the prosecution was that hardly any blood was found on Julie's shirt. The prosecution claimed that all the blood had gotten onto Joel and been absorbed by his clothing. In Julie Rhea's case, the focus was on blood spatter analysis. The prosecution argued that blood stains on Julie's shirt indicated she had wielded the murder weapon. Two analysts supported this theory, but couldn't provide experimental evidence. The defense, on the other hand, presented an expert who testified that the blood had been transferred to Julie's shirt, supporting her version of the struggle with an intruder. Another important element was the discussion about Julie's injuries. The prosecution tried to prove that the blood on her shirt came from Joel, while the defense pointed out that there was no indication that Julie had suffered serious injuries, which would contradict a fight. This complex case shows how crucial forensic evidence can be in a court case, and how differently it can be interpreted. The prosecution's other strategy was to portray Julie, who was described by friends and family as a caring, attentive mother, as a bad mother. Her ex-husband testified that she had considered an abortion when she found out she was pregnant with Joel at the age of 17. Neighbors described that she behaved unpredictably and even coldly immediately after the crime. One neighbor told the jury that Julie, although initially hysterical, never cried. These claims remained largely unchallenged, as Julie's lawyer didn't put her on the stand, which later turned out to be a big mistake. Len, Joel's father, and the state suspected that Julie's motive was to keep Joel away from his father. Len even claimed that Julie's mindset was, "If I can't have him, you can't have him either." However, the prosecution didn't have to prove a motive during the trial, so this statement from Joel's father was just meant to sway the jury. The other controversial element in the trial was Len's testimony that Julie had considered an abortion during her pregnancy with Joel. However, this claim was refuted by Julie's gynecologist, who testified that Julie had done everything for a healthy pregnancy, including strict bed rest at the end of her pregnancy. Julie's lawyer, Brad Vaughn, came forward with strong counterarguments to refute each point of the prosecution. He argued that the condition of the house alone didn't prove there hadn't been an intruder. However, despite her wish to testify, Vaughn advised Julie against it. He feared what might happen if she were cross-examined, and didn't want to risk her saying something wrong that could undermine her defense. Julie's friend Dawn was also called as a witness. Dawn not only emphasized that Julie would never have done anything to her son, but also told that Julie had asked her to stay overnight on the night Joel was murdered. This was meant to support that Julie had no intention of murdering her son, as she had invited someone to stay with her. After the trial was concluded, the jury retired to deliberate. They needed only 5 hours to reach a verdict, a remarkably short time for such a complex case. On March 4, 2002, the verdict was announced. Julie was found guilty on both counts. The jurors said they couldn't find any other explanation. It must have been Julie. Some jurors who were initially undecided were apparently influenced by Julie's decision not to testify. They didn't see this as a defense strategy, but as a sign of guilt. The result? Julie was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Perhaps the outcome of the trial would have been different if she had had a better lawyer with more experience, or even a team of lawyers. Originally, the prosecution sought the death penalty. In Julie's case, however, it reveals how the prosecution can manipulate the legal system to achieve certain results. When the prosecution decided to no longer pursue the death penalty, Julie was denied access to important legal reforms that were supposed to come into effect that year. These reforms were meant to ensure that people facing the death penalty receive adequate legal support, including 2 qualified defenders and additional resources. This approach raises serious questions about the fairness and integrity of the justice system. But Julie didn't give up. She was determined to prove her innocence. In an interview with the popular ABC show 2020, she hoped to draw attention to her case. She believed that her story could reach someone and prove her innocence. And indeed, the interview proved crucial. 2020 is an American television magazine that focuses on human interest stories and true crime cases, similar to America's Most Wanted. On May 31, 2002, just a few weeks after Julie's conviction, ABC aired her story on the show 2020. Crime writer Diane Fanning, who was writing a book about serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells at the time, became aware of Julie's story through the 2020 broadcast. The serial killer Sells had been in contact with her from prison in Texas. Diane Fanning was convinced of Julie's innocence because she realized that her research and correspondence with Sells revealed crucial details that linked him to Joel's murder. Therefore, the author decided to contact Sells again. In a correspondence with the serial killer, she mentioned Joel's murder without specifying the exact date. Sells's reaction was revealing. He remembered a murder that had taken place 2 days before another murder in Springfield, Montana. This was exactly the time of Joel's murder. At this point, Tommy Lynn Sells was already on death row. He had been convicted of murder and attempted murder of 2 girls who were about Joel's age. The pattern of this crime had chilling parallels to Joel's case. In his letter correspondence with crime writer Fanning, he wrote to her that he remembered stabbing a boy 2 days before another crime where he killed 13-year-old Stephanie Mahaney. This information was a breakthrough. Fanning then contacted Texas State Trooper Johnny Allen, who knew Sells. Allen agreed that Sells could also be responsible for Joel's murder. Shortly after, Fanning published her book, suggesting that Sells might also be guilty of Joel's death. So was it possible that Julie had been wrongly convicted? And could Sells really be the true murderer? After the publication of Diane Fanning's book about Sells, the news magazine 2020 conducted an interview with him in prison. As mentioned before, Sells was on death row in Texas. During the interview, he seemed very calm and confessed to murdering Joel. His account of the events matched Julie's story almost perfectly. He entered the house around 4 in the morning, took a knife from a butcher block in the kitchen, and murdered Joel with it. When Julie came in, he attacked her. He lost the knife during the fight and dragged Julie through the hallway outside, where he hit her and repeatedly slammed her head on the ground. These details matched Julie's statements. Interestingly, Prosecutor Parkinson later commented that Sells didn't resemble the person in the sketch Julie had drawn. However, given that the attack took place at night and Julie was hit on the head multiple times, the sketch could still bear some resemblance. In a particularly revealing moment of the interview, Sells refused to refer to Joel as a small child. His response to the interviewer's question revealed an almost remorseful attitude. "It's not easy to live with what I've done." What were the implications of Sells's confession? How will this shocking turn affect Julie's fight for justice? Despite these convincing indications pointing to Julie's innocence, the Illinois court system didn't recognize them. At this point, the Innocence Project got involved to prove Julie's innocence and officially link Sells to Joel Kirkpatrick's murder. The Innocence Project arranged for Bill Clutter, a private investigator specializing in wrongful convictions. He traveled to Lawrenceville to conduct his own investigation. There, he spoke with witnesses who confirmed Julie's version of events. A key statement came from someone who saw a man resembling Sells near the Indiana border. During his investigation, private investigator Clutter also met Sandra, the Greyhound ticket seller from the bus station in Princeton. On the evening of the murder, she had sold a ticket to a man who closely resembled the man in the police composite sketch to Winnemucca, Nevada. She remembered the buyer because he had behaved strangely. This information was potentially important, as Sells was known to use buses as a mode of transportation. Additionally, Clutter received a significant statement from Alan Berkshire, a resident of Lawrenceville, who had a disturbing encounter with a man resembling Sells hours before Joel's murder. Berkshire reported this encounter to the police, but his statement wasn't documented. This new information brought new aspects to Julie's case, but it was still a long way to clearing her innocence. Let's look at an aspect of Tommy Lynn Sells' criminal career. In 1992, Sells attacked a 19-year-old woman who successfully fought him off and survived. She severely injured Sells and escaped. When arrested, Sells had significant injuries. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but was released in early 1997. After his release, Sells vowed never to attack someone his size again, which led to a change in his behavior. If you remember, Julie's 10-year-old son was murdered in the fall of 1997. In 2004, Julie was then released from prison due to a procedural error. Although Julie was still not exonerated for her son's murder, the Innocence Project at least managed to give her back her freedom. However, despite new evidence linking Tommy Lynn Sells to the murder, prosecutor Ed Parkinson filed charges against her again. Julie, who was now married to Mark Hopper, was released on a $75,000 bail. Her husband had enrolled in law school to help her. After her release, Julie enjoyed the feeling of standing in the grass at home again. 2 years later, in 2006, the reopened proceedings began, with the second trial in the town of Carlisle, Illinois. This time, the Innocence Project deployed a strong team of lawyers for Julie's defense. The prosecutor, Parkinson, used the same points and evidence as before, but tried to emotionally influence the jury with pictures of Joel in the doctor's office. So again, the same old tricks as in the first trial. In this second trial of Julie, the defense presented a wealth of new evidence, and this substantiated her innocence. They criticized the police work and showed that the officers had manipulated evidence by working at the crime scene without gloves, and a meteorologist refuted the assumption that dew in the grass could have proven someone's presence. Moreover, the prosecution's theory about the broken glass in the door was debunked. The defense argued that the blood on Julie's shirt didn't come from her son, but from a third party. They also questioned the credibility of Sells's confession and emphasized that his retraction and the inconsistencies in his statement raised reasonable doubts about Julie's guilt. The prosecution again focused on the analysis of blood spatter patterns, and they brought their alleged expert, Englert, back to the witness stand. But this time, Englert, who had made some of the state's most damning statements in the first trial, focused on a theory he had never mentioned in Julie's first trial. When examining her T-shirt, he said, he saw evidence that a bloody hand had pressed against it. The source of the blood, he said, could only have been Joel's bloody hands. His testimony suggests a horrible scenario. that Joel had tried to push his mother away as she stabbed a knife into him. However, the expert Englert admitted during cross-examination that he had never requested measurements of Joel's hands for comparison purposes. As a witness for the defense, their forensic consultant questioned whether Englert, the prosecution's expert, had even used a scientific method to reach his conclusion. "I have seen nothing to indicate that this area was examined for this purpose, and data collected, comparisons made, and any conclusion or hypothesis drawn," said the defense's forensic consultant, referring to the T-shirt on which there was allegedly evidence that a bloody hand had pressed against it. "There is no scientific basis for such a claim," he said. The defense further argued that Julie's injuries on the night of the murder couldn't have been self-inflicted, and that investigators had missed clues pointing to an intruder. They also played the jury the audio recording of serial killer Sells' confession. The lifelong drifter had confessed to numerous other crimes, and some of his accounts shook the credibility of the prosecution's theory. The defense further bolstered their case by presenting evidence suggesting that Sells had been in the vicinity of Lawrenceville at the time of Joel's murder. Julie finally testified on the witness stand herself and was able to tell the jury her side of the story. She insisted that she absolutely did not kill her son. Julie's testimony in court was a key moment. She spoke about her love for Joel and her fear after his murder. Her emotional responses and visible injuries supported her version of events. Finally, the jury reached a verdict. Julie was found not guilty, a decision that elicited both shock and relief. When the jury announced the not guilty verdict on July 26, 2006, Julie let out a primal scream. Her knees gave way as she fell to the floor. In a later interview with the New York Times, Julie recounted how she felt after the acquittal. "I thought everything would be better. I thought I could now study law or finish my doctorate. I thought I was strong and able to help other people and give something back to my family and friends who had given me so much. I just had no idea what it would be like." Instead, at the time of her acquittal, Julie was still shaken, not only because of her son's violent death and 2 criminal trials, but also because of the trauma of incarceration. She hesitates to talk about the physical and emotional abuse she suffered during the nearly 4 years she spent behind bars, except to say that she was verbally abused by both inmates and guards. "What I had allegedly done was considered the only unforgivable sin," she said. Despite her acquittal, she soon found that she had to continue living under the weight of suspicion. The prosecutors in the case still referred to her as a criminal. Edwin Parkinson, the lead prosecutor in her case, told reporters, "The jury found her not guilty. They didn't find her innocent." Despite intensive therapy, her faith, and a service dog meant to alleviate the effects of her post-traumatic stress disorder, Julie struggled through daily life. The marriage to her husband, whom she had married shortly before her first trial, and who believed so firmly in her innocence that he studied law to defend her, failed in the years following her acquittal. She also had difficulties finding work. Knowing that her first conviction would come to light one way or another, sooner or later, she was honest with potential employers from the start and told them about her case in the job interview. Julie said, "After the person interviewing me picked their jaw up off the floor, I was told the job had already been offered to someone else." Although she was officially exonerated in 2010 when a district court in Illinois issued her a certificate of innocence, she struggled to find work. In 2011, Julie moved to the U.S. state of Tennessee, where her parents lived, hoping for a fresh start. She tried her hand as an entrepreneur, including opening a bed and breakfast, but nothing worked out. She is currently unemployed and fears for the future. "I have no income at the moment," she said. "I don't know what to do." After her acquittal, Julie's life has, understandably, changed dramatically. While she herself struggles with the aftermath of her case in daily life, today she advocates for wrongfully convicted women. But for Julie herself, any reform comes too late. She said, "Joel still needs justice. He's never seen a day of it. My acquittal just brought us back to the same level." She firmly believes that Tommy Lynn Sells was her attacker on that fateful night, and that he was the one who killed Joel. She regrets that he will never be held accountable for the murder of her son. Because the serial killer Sells was executed in prison in Huntsville, Texas, on April 3, 2014. So he was and will never be charged with Joel's murder. Time and again, Julie wished she had woken up earlier on the night Joel was murdered. Then, she believes, she could have saved her son, or could have died trying. In the interview for the NY Times article, which appeared on December 20, 2018, she said, her voice tinged with emotion, "I tucked Joel in, but I feel so guilty that I didn't hold him longer." That's all she can say about the worst night of her life. When she tries to say more, she breaks down. When she had composed herself, she added, "Surviving the murder of your child and then finding out that you're accused of murdering your child is a kind of trauma I wouldn't wish on any living being. Being branded a child murderer separated me from society. I will always have a scarlet letter on my forehead. Nothing will ever be able to change that." At the end of this sad case, one can only say that Julie's own experience shows how easily someone can be wrongly convicted. Because despite her innocence, Julie continues to struggle with the emotional consequences and the stigma that clings to her and makes her life difficult. Theoretically, the case surrounding Joel Kirkpatrick remains unsolved, as Tommy Lynn Sells was never officially charged or convicted of Joel's murder. However, many believe that the true perpetrator was executed with him. Before we end this episode, let's take a moment to reflect on a fundamental principle of our legal system: innocent until proven guilty. This principle should be the foundation of every fair trial. But in Julie Rhea's case, we see a frightening example of how this principle was turned on its head. From the beginning, Julie was considered guilty. The investigators, the prosecution, and even parts of the public had already convicted her long before she stood trial. Instead of the prosecution having to prove her guilt, Julie found herself forced to prove her innocence. A nearly impossible task, given the emotional nature of the case and the biased investigation. This case shows us how fragile our legal system can be. When prejudices, public pressure, or overzealous prosecution take the upper hand, the principle of innocent until proven guilty can quickly become an empty phrase. Julie's experience is a wake-up call for all of us to remain vigilant and defend the basic principles of justice. It's frightening to see how quickly a grieving mother can become the main suspect, and then the convicted without solid evidence. Her case reminds us that, as a society, we must critically question how investigations are conducted and judgments are made. Because if it can happen to Julie, it can happen to any of us. Let's end this episode with the thought that true justice can only exist when we not only preach the principle of innocent until proven guilty, but also practice it in every single case. Only then can we ensure a justice system that truly deserves its name.